A final option to consider before moving on to the handle is texturing the cylinder. Texture can make the pot really nice to hold in your hands, and when you glaze a pot, the glaze is going to pool and fill the texture and highlight some of the colors in the glaze. Here I'm just using a chunk of concrete and I'm stamping it into the clay. What's important is that you have a hand on the inside supporting the clay when you do this. You can experiment with all kinds of tools and press it into the clay. Now, I'm just using a practice cylinder here. If you had one like that, you could use that to test, or you could just press a flat slab of clay, let it become leather hard, and then experiment with different clay tools and see what works. Now, normally with a slab mug, you can actually texture it before you make it into a cylinder, but for flattened coil, you really have to assemble the cylinder first. You can also use a ribbon tool, not a wire tool. Notice the ribbon tool has a sharper blade. You can use a ribbon tool to carve into the clay. There's some potters doing some really neat stuff with this. It's also really satisfying to do. You just have to make sure your clay is leather hard. And what's really important with carving especially, but also with stamping, don't go too deep into the clay. You don't want to make any holes here. I mean, worst case scenario, you could score and slip some clay in there, smooth it out, and touch it up later. Here, as I go, I'm using this sponge to clean up any little goobers or crumbs. Sometimes it can be nice to experiment with a flared rim. If you want to, you can pinch out the rim a little bit, and then what you do is you use your fingers to sort of bend the rim out. When you bend that rim out, it does a couple of things. Changes the shape of the pot, obviously, but it actually creates a highlight on the rim and a shadow just below. That can really accentuate the form of your pot. Just don't go too overboard with it. Flared rim that flares out way too much, think the bell of a trumpet, that's going to be very hard to drink out of, and it's going to look a little clunky. A final strategy to consider is bellying out your pot. If you want to have a slab that's curved out a little bit, rub a little bit of water on your fingers and just move your hands back and forth on the inside of that cylinder while gently pushing out. You can see I'm using my other hand to support the bottom of the pot where I don't want it to belly out. This can also expand the texture that you have and highlight it even further. Again, just don't go too overboard with it. And generally, you want to try to make something that is symmetrical. However, some artists intentionally make things asymmetrical if you're going for that too. Now, this little cylinder I'm using here is just for demonstration. If you wanted a keeper, a mug that you're going to fire and glaze, it's important that you don't go overboard with multiple kinds of textures. It's generally better to stick with just one or two and more evenly cover the surface of the clay. Try to avoid patterns and cheesy stamping. You want something that just is a texture that would be nice to hold.